Good.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Essex Branch Ontario Genealogical Society monthly meeting. We're very pleased that you have been able to come out tonight. And I think you'll find the presentation that we offer tonight to be most interesting and informative for sure. Before we get into that, just a bit of information about that might be of use to you. First of all, you should be aware that as of about a year ago, we have begun to live stream and record the meetings. And that basically is for expanding our reach to our membership. Because at the present time, about 3/4 of the membership of the Essex branch does not live within the Essex area. So this way, with technology, as many branches are doing, it's an opportunity and a method to reach the members who are not able to attend in person. So just be aware of that situation. How many people here are visiting for the first time? Very good. Welcome. Thank you very much. Welcome to you as well. We hope you find it worthwhile and informative. Just a bit of information and background. Most of you are aware of this, but for those of you who may be new, we have been in operation for over 50 years, the Ontario Genealogical Society. There are branches and special interest groups all across Ontario. Our own branch particularly focuses on Essex County and general family research as well. We have a resource collection, which may be of interest and value to you in the work that you're researching. We have monthly meetings, of which this is the April meeting. And we have a website which is growing and growing and growing. And so if you haven't been on it recently, I certainly invite you to do so because you'll find a lot of valuable information there. The website is just essex.ogs.on.ca, and the members only part of that website, as well as the general information, has been increasing exponentially. So there's an awful lot of material there that you may find helpful if you haven't been on it recently. Also part of Facebook. A number of other things that you may very well be interested in the future. Our upcoming events for the last two meetings that we have before the summer. The May meeting, it will be Deirdre Aaron from the Detroit Genealogical Society and Facebook group. And we've talked about her, with her. She grew up on the Windsor side or the Essex County side of the border and on the Michigan side of the border. Family on both sides, so back and forth on a regular basis. So she's going to talk a little bit about her experience of having cross-border ancestors, what the differences are, what that did in terms of what she was able to understand. And in June, we're very fortunate. We have Sandra Joyce coming in June. Sandra is an expert, and as it says, her father was a British home child. So the meeting in June will feature Sandra, who has been doing work with the British home child, and talk about her own personal experiences of her family about this. And I think you'll find that most interesting if you really are not that familiar with the British home children situation. Just a sort of an advertisement here, related certainly. A Living History Festival that will be happening this month in about a week and a half. Let's see, we're in Rivertown, we're King's Amherstburg at Navy Yard Park. So be aware of that date if that's something you might be interested in attending. It's only about half an hour down the road. Something for people who may have an interest in Lambton County. A full day workshop. And topics are there. Keynote speaker is Mike Quackenbush, and some other information is listed as well. So not too far down the road, but it might be something you'd like to partake of. I'll just say at this point, these slides I will put on the table for later in the meeting when we have a chance to take a look at them. If you want detailed information, record that for future reference. They'll be there for your information. The conference is coming quickly. June 3rd and 5th in Toronto, and what I've been hearing is the registrations have been phenomenal. The numbers are just unbelievable in terms of people who are attending this year. And so they're really expecting that they'll have a full house and maybe overflow. So if you're interested in attending, it's always an excellent way to meet others and to learn information that may help you in your own research and understanding. Okay, tonight, presentation, as you can see, a lot of French names up there. And we are very pleased to have Cathy Knight with us. She has spoken many times about the issue of deep names, which is something that is associated with French families throughout the years. What does it mean? How did it happen? Well, Cathy's going to be able to tell us tonight a little bit about that. And so at this point, I'm just going to have that title there. And
that's actually Cathy's
that's her,
PowerPoint.
okay.
Yeah.
Hey, that's fine, you can leave it.
Fair enough. I'll put this on for you to take later on. Cathy, it's all yours.
Okay.
I need the little.
Sure can. I don't need it with me.
That's the same thing.
I apologize, I'm just recovering from hip surgery, so I'm gonna sit. And hopefully you'll be able to hear me. It's been about 5 years since I've done a presentation for the branch. And I always enjoy the opportunity to talk about any number of things that we do when we research. I got involved in genealogy and the branch in the 1980s, not as long as some people here actually, but quite a long time ago. And I got involved in French Canadian genealogy simply as a volunteer researcher for the branch. My mother was born in Quebec, but my family is entirely British and entirely Anglo. I'm telling you this that you understand it is perfectly possible to be a unilingual Anglophone and do French Canadian research. It is entirely possible because I do it. The issue of D names, and I'm going to try very hard to call them D names. Although as an Anglo, I've spent about 25 years calling them DID names. The issue of D names is really intimidating on its face for many people, particularly people who are not used to or not experienced in French Canadian genealogy. And it's a lot more intimidating than it needs to be. This evening we're going to talk a little bit about where D names came from, how they developed and came to be used, and how you can use them. And we're also going to talk a little bit about French names in general and some quirks and some interesting things about French Canadian research. Now, when people first came to Quebec, we were at the point where people had both a given name and a surname. That's an advantage because if we've been dealing in medieval records, we've been talking about people who had perhaps one name. So they're coming to Canada from Quebec, from France, with a given name and a surname. And basically, as we understand it now, children inherited their father's surname. So that's what we're generally dealing with, which is an advantage in all kinds of genealogy, certainly Quebec genealogy, French Canadian genealogy. But there are some practical problems. That just has to do with general genealogical research. First one is the spelling is not standardized. We think that our name is spelled a certain way. I have certainly gotten into rather heated arguments with people about spelling of their surname and the fact that they could not be related to this person because that person had an S on the end of their name. Now, I knew for a fact it was the same family, but it was very hard to persuade them because they had a notion of a fixed spelling, that was not really, that was not consistent over time. So spellings are an issue. Now, the reality, of course, is that most people are illiterate, so they couldn't go around correcting the spelling. I worked, for the first 20 years of my professional career, I worked for Canada Pension Old Age Pension. And that was in the 70s and 80s, and I was still meeting people who were signing with an X. So the issue of illiteracy is certainly one that goes back into many, many records that we are likely to be coming across. So they don't know how to spell their name. The priest may not know how to spell their name if they're writing it in the parish records. You have to get past the notion of there is only one way to spell this name. That is not correct, and it's going to hold you back unless you can get past that. Also, when you're looking at old records, we're dealing with handwritten records. They are as good as the person who writes them. Each person who writes has a style of writing. They have a style of shaping letters that may be unique to them. And you may see records where N's look like U's or S's look like F's. There are variations in the way that writing shows up in records, and you have to be flexible about that and a bit open-minded about how you're looking at these things. There are also issues of what names sound like. Boucher and Boucher, for example, can sound very similar. And you will see a record of a family change when the surname or the spelling change when the priest changes. Because the priest is hearing it slightly differently or recognizes that as a slightly different name. So there are some variations based on just the way people are hearing it, the way things are being entered. There are issues of pronunciation, there are issues of regional accents, there are a lot of factors that go into this. And then we're dealing with records that are being transcribed. When you're taking a record that's handwritten, the transcription is as good as the person who is looking at it. The classic issue for those of us who use online records is Ancestry. Ancestry is horrible at transcriptions. I am going to talk about that a little bit when I talk about the records that I recommend. I really do recommend Ancestry, but they do have some issues. There could be something as simple as a typo. You've simply written it down wrong. When we do things like the cemetery transcripts, people would go over other people's records. You do it multiple times. When the Mormons transcribe records, they'll do a parish register. It goes to 3 separate people to have it cross-checked because there are so many possibilities of errors of people doing misunderstanding or writing it down incorrectly. And to get the best, most perfect copy, you need to watch out for that, the typos which are rife. So you end up with a name that can be written many ways. One of the classic examples, this is the one I've used here, is Charbonneau. There are at least 55 different known spellings for what is clearly the name Charbonneau. It can be spelled B-O-N-O on the end rather than E-A-U. It could be spelled A-U on the end, or it could be spelled with it. Notice this one with 2 U's. That's just the way it was spelled. Or Charbonneau with an E. All kinds of possibilities. This is all the same name. This is another example of please don't get hung up on how it's spelled because it is likely the same name. So be flexible when you're looking at the records. Now, given names have a format. And in Quebec, it had a very specific format. The Catholic Church decided that there are a list of names that you could have. You could not take names from another source other than the list. And the list was supposed to be based on a name for a saint that would protect and guide that child throughout their life. It was published in the Rituel de Diocèse de Québec, which was published in 1702, 1703. So as far back as 1703, given names were fixed in Quebec. Monsignor de Saint-Vallier stipulated the church forbid priests from allowing profane or ridiculous names to be given to the child, such as Apollon, Diane, etc. Now, I wouldn't have thought Diana was a terrible name, but the church wouldn't allow it. But it commands that the child shall be given the name of a male or female saint, depending on its sex, so that it can imitate the virtues and feel the effects of God's protection. And this stood for many, many, many years. And I think there are still issues in Quebec given names. There are certainly issues in France of given names. The government of France will not allow names that they think are ridiculous. So it's a concept that holds to this day. There were 1,251 approved names for boys and 373 approved names for girls. And that was it. So that was your choice. In France, the most common names for boys were Jean and Pierre. And for girls, Marie, Madeleine, Marguerite, Anne, and Jeanne. In Quebec, Jean-Baptiste and Joseph were the most popular boys' names. And if you look at records in Essex County around the turn of the last century, every boy was Joseph and every girl was Marie. So you know that this is something that's very consistent in Quebec or French records. Similarly, the name Marie was more popular in Quebec, while Jeanne held sway in France. I'm going to show you a list. This shows you the most popular names. Jean-Baptiste is the most popular for boys by a fair bit. It's over 22,000 entries in PRDH. This is a very well-established Quebec record database, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Joseph is the second most popular. I want you to look at the girls' names, though. It said that Marie was the most common name, but Marie, in and of itself, is not the most common name. It's Marie Joseph, Marie Louise, Marie Anne, Marie Marguerite, and it's not until you get down to number 8 that you see Marie. If you see Marie in a record, that person's name is Marie. It is not Marie Joseph. It is not Marie Angelique. Don't mix them up. It is a separate standalone name. It took me quite a long time to figure that out, so I'm going to save you the trouble of having to go through that so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Note that Marie is a totally separate standalone name on its own. Having said all of those things, the biggest problem in looking at Quebec records or doing French genealogical research is the notion of the D names. It literally means said, and you find it throughout the entirety of Quebec naming patterns. From the very beginning, D names were used. They're attached to the proper name or this given surname by the word D. So if you look at the records, it will say a name, it will say D, it will say a second name. We could call it called, or named, or namely, or to wit, or also known as, any one of those things that indicate that this is an additional name. And it's so French in its usage, there's really not an English comparable situation to that. A D name is added to the family name. It is a legal name in and of itself, and it is a legal name with the original name. It is not an alias in the sense of you were a bank robber and you changed your name from Smith to Jones so that they wouldn't know you were a bank robber. It was a name that everybody knew in connection with the original name, so it's an added on name and additional name. Many members of the same family could use that name and usually did use that name. And this family-wide usage, rather than unique to an individual, is something that's very uncommon, except in France and in Quebec and in some places in the northern part of Scotland. There are many origins for D-names. It's a military nickname is one of the most prominent original reasons for the use. It can be related to a physical characteristic for a person. It could be the immigrant's place of origin. It could be the name of a fief for nobles. We'll talk about some of these things. It could be mother's family name, father's first name. There are many reasons that D-names are attached to people. And some reasons are just utterly incomprehensible. I have no idea why they ever picked any of them, why they picked those names. Some go back to the ancestors. Others are introduced by descendants. Some are transmitted, some are not. Some belong to entire family name, and some only belong to a branch of the family name. There's one that we'll talk about a little later that only belongs to one branch of the family name. Now, I've included this in the handout. This is a bit of a write-up about how the military record came to be so prominent for the introduction of D-names. This comes out of French regiments, and it was part of a notion of trying to separate the recruit from their family and from the town that they came from, and attach them to the regiment. So they created these D-names as Nom de Guerre. Very often, many people in the same regiment would have the same D-name. It would be attached often to the captain who commanded the company in which this person worked. And because so much early settlement, male settlement, was based on retired soldiers, D-names were very prominent coming in through this military usage. So that's one of the sources. This is from an article by Robin Hyder, which is on it's from a website online. It's at acadian.org. And it's a very good article about D-names in general, and gives some other information about this. But I thought it was a really good explanation for Nom de Guerre, which is a major initial source of where these records came from. Now, from a practical point of view, an individual can have a D-name at just about any time. And there are no rules to predict when. It can just suddenly appear 6 generations out. It can be an additional D-name 3 generations out that's used for 1 or 2 generations and then disappears. They come and they go. And really, there is no way of telling. Among some of the reasons, as I said, there was surnames used in the army, and there also can be other names attached to that. Place of origin, Lanois and Langevin are 2 D-names that relate back to places that people came from in France. Land owned or inhabited by an ancestor. Beauregard's an example of that. We're going to talk about a couple of other examples of that. This is what I thought was fun. The full name of an ancestor. Gaston Gay was the original French settler. Over time, the name sort of transmuted itself and became Gaston Gay and became Caston Gay. So most Caston Gays in Canada are descended from Gaston Gay. That's the original source of that name. The first name of an ancestor often will appear as a D-name. I've seen this quite a bit, where the gentleman's father, for example, first name was Vincent. He would show up with the surname and then D. Vincent. That's very common. You can keep the original name in a local language, sometimes during the process of standardizing names to French. After a while, people stopped recognizing where the name came from. It was just part of their name. It just was their name. One example of that is the Houdon de Beaulieu family. It was originally Houdon. Beaulieu was added as a nickname. You will find descendants who use Beaulieu de Houdon. So they flip the names. You'll sometimes find the name hyphenated. That's fairly common, so you need to be aware that that's another way of expressing a D name as a hyphenated name. And any Hudon might very well be a volute. So you have to be aware that either of those names can be used in connection with your ancestor. So if you have a volute, you're looking for a Hudon. If you have a Hudon, you're looking for a volute. Some names like Roy, or Roy, if you're an Anglo, have several or many different D names. The Roy name is the most common surname in Quebec. There were many, many, many different Roy original ancestors, so you're not all descended from the same guy. In PRDH, which has the most published transcribed records from Quebec record sources, there are over 65,000 entries referring to the surname Hudon, or surname Roy, sorry. So it's quite massive, and there are dozens of potential D names. The two most common D names are Desjardins and OD. Desjardins, there are 3,466 examples of that as a D name amongst those 65,000 raw entries in PRDH, and over 1,000 OD examples of D names. Simeon Roy OD was the first of the Rois who used that surname. Antoine Roy Desjardins was the first of the Rois who used the Desjardins surname. They're not related to each other. They're quite separate families, and the reason you need to be aware of that is, if you find a source that tells you that Pierre Ody is Francois Desjardins' father, that's not very likely, because these are two quite separate and distinct families. And the nicknames are not transferable amongst those two families. So I would be skeptical of that. Sometimes the name just attaches to one family or one branch. This is how you look at D names. A generic name is built like this. You have Joseph Jarrett de Beauregard. Joseph is the first or given name. Jarrett, in this case, is the patronym or ancestral family name. Beauregard in this name is the D name. In this case, is the D name. After some generations, you start getting confused about which is the D name and which is the family name. So the names can end up being switched, Beauregard to Jarrett. However, it's also possible that both family and D names are switched the first time anybody used a D name. So it could be the first person who came from France, it could be 4 generations out where these D names show up. Because they're actual legal aliases, they can replace the original patronym, so that for legal purposes in a record, like a parish register, you can have Joseph Beauregard, you can have Joseph Jarrett de Beauregard, you can have Joseph Jarrett, or Joseph Beauregard de Jarrett. So you've got 4 possibilities for this guy, and that's assuming there's one D name. There could be 2 D names or 3 D names, but assuming there's one. Let's assume that our Joseph gets married to Jeanne Joachim, or Joachim if you come from Essex County, Diet Laverdier. Her possible names are Jeanne Joachim Diet Laverdier, Jeanne Laverdier, or Jeanne Laverdier Diet Joachim. So you got 4 names and 4 names, and you've got 16 possible combinations. How you handle this depends on whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of person. If you're a glass half empty kind of person, you're going to say, I can't handle this, this is too much, I give up. If you are a glass half full kind of person, you're going to look at this and say, look at all the options I have for getting this right. Look at all my clues. So I'm advising you to be a glass half full kind of a person. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a few minutes. I talked a little bit about fiefs and owning property. Some of the people in Quebec at the early records had very good connections or were able to create enough wealth and enough influence that they were given significant land grants. They are called seigneuries normally, and they assume the title of seigneur or sieur de, modeling themselves on what was going on in France. They were given the opportunity to have these titles confirmed by the government. If they were on the ball, they did that because it became advantageous for them down the road. I've come across people who were given the original land grants, didn't follow through on it, and had problems with it a little bit later. This was a big deal. They really liked being sieur de or seigneur de, and they would have their parish records, page and a half of parish records with 16 different people who signed off on it, and all of their titles and attached to it, making themselves look as if they really were somebody. And the names of the land, the estates, which was a D name, were very, very important to these people. Sometimes the name of the landed estate was so important it swamped the original name. The children were very impressed with this. They tried to hang on to the names. By about the middle of by the beginning of the 1800s, the sieur de or seigneur de part got dropped, but this D name that was attached to the land went on and on and on. And over time, the children or great-grandchildren flipped the names from the original name to this name that was attached to the land. So that you've got this as a D name that you have to contend with as a genealogist. An example of this is the Trottier family. All the Trottiers in North America are descended from Jules Trottier, who was born in Maine and came to Quebec in 1645. He had a number of children, and they all had large families, and a number of his children got these kinds of land grants. And they became Trottier Sieur de Ruisseau, Trottier Sieur de l'Île Perrot, Trottier Sieur de Beaubien, and many of these Trottiers gradually dropped the family name, the Trottier name, and signed only the assumed title name, which was the land grant. So you have the families of Beaubien, de Rousseau, etc., all who trace back to a common ancestor who was Jules Trottier. And if you look at that D name, you would not have a clue that Trottier was the original name. They would hang on to these names through family pride, and I've given you kind of a local example of this. Jean Cuillerier was living in Detroit, and he married at St. Anne's, Detroit, Marie Catherine Trottier de Ruisseau. Now, her family were one of these Trottiers who were attached to land grants. In her case, it was de Ruisseau. After her Jean Cuillerier's death, she had children. They had children. She turned around and married at Fort Pontchartrain, Francois Picot de Balestre, who was an officer at the fort. But the records indicate that she also used another one of those Trottier names. Besides the Ruisseau, she used the Beaubien name. For some reason that her children by Cuillerier latched onto the Beaubien name. And over time, dropped the Cuillerier name entirely and became Beaubien. And that's a big family in Michigan. And they were actually Cuilleriers, and who became Beaubien through the mom, and who were really Trottiers. So this is kind of an example of how these D names take on a life of their own. Now this is a screen capture from Pierre DH. And this is the marriage record of Jeanne Crierier and Mary Catherine Trottier du Ruisseau. And bottom child is Jean-Baptiste, who married Marie-Anne Lodin de Barrois. It's St. Anne's, Detroit, 1742. This was the Jean-Baptiste, the son, picked up the name Beaubien. So by that generation, he's using Beaubien. And when he got married, that was the name that he used. So that's how that Beaubien name came into, although his name technically is Crierier. So that's how the Beaubien name came into use in Michigan. It was basically through that D name connection. Another way that D names came into use was people had the habit of naming themselves and other people. Primarily as a method of trying to distinguish themselves one from the other. For example, one family used the patronym or the last name of Lupien, that it was a Baron family. So it was Baron, which was the family name, did Lupien, to distinguish it from other Baron families in the area. Lupien was the Christian name or the given name of the ancestor. So it's the original settler was Nicholas Baron de Lupien, but his name is Lupien because his dad's name was Lupien. You see underneath, yeah, Lupien Baron. And I've seen that a lot. That comes up quite often when you're picking up a parent's name. Sometimes from the mom. So that's another way that D names came into use. Some of them are quite fun. One that is only local, and I always thought was quite charming, was one of the composts was named D Niagara, because his parents were on the way to Montreal when he was born. He was born at the Portage of Niagara. And that's where that D name came into use. So it's a very local example that's, I always thought was quite amusing. Some names are given by Indians. Two of them are Labadie de Badichon, which is a local usage, and Pelletier de Antaya. Both of them are attached to people being married to Indians. That's basically what's happening here. The Labadie de Badichon only applies to the Labadie family where the female ancestor was Native American. There are many other Labadies, there are many sibling Labadies. The only Badichons are descended from that particular marriage. So if you're looking for an Aboriginal ancestor and Badichon is your name, that's probably your link. You probably have that there. Pelletier de Antaya comes from Francois Pelletier, who married Dorothy Sauvages, by whom he had no children. But for some reason, because of that marriage, he assumed his surname Antaya. It's very well known that it's related to that first marriage. Married Marguerite Morisseau, and the Antaya came into use for the descendants of Francois and Marguerite because of his marriage to Dorothy Sauvages. So the Antayas are coming from that Pelletier and that name.
Is Antaya a native name?
No. And why it's Antaya, I have no idea. But you'll see that multiple references indicate that's where it came in. Why Antaya was picked, I don't know. I don't know if the Aboriginal people who were associated with Dorothy gave it to him. But that's where it got picked up. And if you note in the bottom, he adopted the name Antaya after his first union with an Amerindian. And that's generally what's accepted as where it came to play. Now, some names were just kind of goofy names. So there's an example of a family named Poisson, which sounds like poisson, which is fish, adding lasaline, which is salt. So you got Poisson de lasaline, which is saltfish. Another example is what we would recognize as actual nicknames. And a very good example is the Letourneau family, which is a local family. Jean-Baptiste Letourneau, who lived in Sandwich opposite the Michigan Central Depot, present-day Detroit, about 110 years ago. He was known by everyone as Jeanette because he was a kind of little guy. And by incorrect spellings, he became Jeanette and Jeanette. Hence, Letourneau de Jeanette became the name. And he has numerous descendants who are often called Jeanette. Jeanette Avenue is named for this guy. It's one of the examples of names in Windsor that are based on the strip farms of the original French owners who had them. So Jeanette Avenue is the place where Jean-Baptiste Letourneau lived. And that's where the name came into play. Now, another example of that, which is local, is Louis Valère. Very, very well known. Lots and lots of descendants. Born in France in 1708 and came directly from France to Detroit. So he didn't do any side trip through Quebec. He came directly here. And the story is that he was such a kindly and generous friend and neighbor that they began to call him St. Louis because he was just such a nice guy. And the D name St. Louis came into play then. And the St. Louis D name is now the name that most of his descendants are known by, including my sister-in-law. So it's a huge family name, all from Louis Valère and his great and generous heart. This is a screen capture for his family. You can see the original guy, Louis Valère from France. The D name is showing up immediately in the records as St. Louis. These are some of his kids. Now, in Quebec, almost no D names are sourced from occupations. Some are, but not anything like what you see in other situations. Forgeron, which is a blacksmith, is a source of La Forge. That's one example of a D name that comes from the French. But if you're looking at English names, for example, Smith is an occupation named Wright, Taylor, Cooper, Baker, Thrasher, my name, which is Knight, are all occupation names. And it is very, very common in English and very, very rare in French. So if you're looking for a source of a D name, it's not likely to be occupational. Now that I've overwhelmed you with the D names, we're going to talk a little bit more about some other things. One of the ways that names are changed in French is by adding and dropping letters. An example that's local is the name Shane, which was originally spelled with an S, and the S was dropped. And Etienne, which is originally spelled with an S, and the S was dropped. This is part of the conversion of Old French to contemporary French. This is one of my favorite things. Sauvage versus sauvage. If I had $1 for everybody who came to me and said, "Can you find me my Aboriginal ancestor?" I would be fabulously wealthy. And it's usually accompanied by somebody with a picture saying, "Look at my grandmother. Doesn't she look like an Indian?" There are not very many people who are descended from Aboriginals in North America, and the ones who are pretty well documented. But there's a real trap with sauvage. Sauvage is a legitimate French name from France. Here's an example. Jeanne Sauvage, which is an immigrant ancestress. Her father was Jean Sauvage. Her mother was Anne Dupuy. She came from Charente in France. got married in France in 1634, and Sauvage was her name when she got married. The Sauvage name actually refers to somebody who is uncivilized, or someone who lives in the wild, or someone who lives in the woods. And there's a sort of folklore element attached to the use of that name. When the name came into usage in North America, we picked up on that original French concept or French usage and applied it to people who were uncivilized, who lived in the woods. And we called those people savages, sauvage, based on that original French meaning of the name, which wasn't originally a French name. Now here's our friend Francois Pelletier again, who married, who became the Antaya. His wife is identified as Sauvagesse, or Dorothy Sauvagesse, in the records. This is a legitimate usage of that name to identify an Amerindian, Canadian Aboriginal. And her origin, if you can see in the record, is Sauvagesse. Now this is a very famous local example, and I want to show you this because this is a really good way of identifying Aboriginal names. This is Pierre Roy, one of the many 65,000 Rois that are in the records, and Marguerite Wabinkikwe. These are the two spellings that are common in PRDH. Wabinkikwe is the spelling that I'm more familiar with, and the pronunciation that is normally used here. These are local people. The name is spelled Uwa Kesikukuwe, or a variation on that, and that OU is very, very common in Aboriginal names where the surname of the Aboriginal partner is known. And if you see it written, it's sort of like a circle with little horns on it, like the astrological symbol for Taurus the bull. If you see that, that's a U pronunciation. So we've got Marguerite Wabinkikwe, who married Pierre Roy. They had many more children than this. All the children are very well identified. This is an extremely well documented Aboriginal ancestor, and I've gotten people, I've assisted people who've gotten Métis status cards on the strength of this marriage. So that's a legitimate one. Those are the kinds of things you're looking for, is this Wabinkikwe sounding name, except when they're not. Here's a very, very famous example. Ignace Raisin, Shuantakawani, and Mary Elizabeth Mims, Tuatugawatch. So you've got a couple of those U names there. They're married in Oka, Quebec. That's a very big Indian stronghold. You've got every reason to believe these are your Aboriginal ancestors. You got it made, you're going to get your Métis card, your Indian card. Except, look at Mom and Dad. Jeanne Raisin and Sarah Hall. Well, Sarah Hall doesn't sound very much like an Indian name. And Godfrey Mims and Mirabelle Sneed. Those don't sound very much like Aboriginal names. Ignace Raisin Shuantakawani, who was married in 1771 in Oka, and these are his parents. This couple got married in Oka, Bishop records, are really Josiah Rising, who was born in 1694 in Suffield, Hartford, Connecticut, to John Rising and Sarah Hall, and Abigail Mims, Mary Elizabeth, was Abigail Mims. She was born on the 17th of May, 1700, in Deerfield, Suffolk, Massachusetts, daughter of Jeffrey Mims and Mehinabel Sneed Hall. Deerfield is kind of a red flag. If you see Deerfield, you should have a pretty good indication of what's just happened. It was a small village on the Connecticut River in Massachusetts, surrounded by a stockade. Had several hundred people in it. In February, they were attacked by a group of French, Huron, and Iroquois Indians. The whole place was attacked. They went through this village, they broke down doors, they killed people, they destroyed the village, virtually destroyed the village. 47 people are known to have been killed, and 112 people were taken prisoners. And all of that took place in one day. What they did with the prisoners is they forced marched them back to Quebec. It lasted 25 days. 12 prisoners died because of wounds, bad treatment, or the cold weather. And you can just imagine what it would be like trying to be forced marched from Connecticut to Quebec. Among the prisoners who survived were a 10-year-old boy named Josiah Rising and a 4-year-old girl named Abigail Mims. Along with Abigail was her mother Mehinabel and brother Ebenezer. Mehinabel died on the journey, so she's one of those people who died in that 25-day march. Ebenezer was ransomed and went back to New England. The problem with Abigail is she was 4 when she was taken. She was raised by an Indian family. As far as she was concerned, from very early on, she was Indian and Roman Catholic. She could not be persuaded to return. They tried very hard to persuade her to return. They had diplomatic letters going back and forth from New England to the government in Quebec. The girl would not go back. And these are the ancestors, despite the fact they look to be Indian, of a whole lot of descendants, Raisin descendants in North America. Now, maybe you have French ancestry, and maybe you don't. Sometimes you can't really tell. You could have an English name that really was a French name, and it just got converted somewhere along the way. These are actual names that are Essex County conversions. So these are names that have happened here. Bois Vert converted to Greenwood. La Framboise is raspberry. There are people with that name here, and they used to be La Framboise. Roi is king. Bon Enfant, good child, which is a very big family in Essex County, all descended from Bon Enfants. Another example of am I French, am I not French, is the Gilboe family. This is a big family from Gossville. So it's in the southern part of the county. It's not a French part of the county. It's not particularly Roman Catholic part of the family. The original ancestor known in Essex County is Joseph Gilboe. He appears in one census, the 1861 census, and he said he was born in Lower Canada. So he's saying he was born in Quebec. And he is giving his age, which would indicate he's born around 1795. Now, I'm assuming he knows when he was born, and I'm assuming he knows where he was born, so I'm assuming Quebec is correct. What I did was I had a look in the Quebec records at every single Joseph Gilboe with the spelling, because that's what the name is. That's how the name got turned around here. And all the records in Essex County are showing like that, including his, he married a Weigel. It looks so English, and he is not so English. So I looked in all the records. There are 8 possible Joseph Gilboes, only 8, which is nice. It could have been a whole lot more, who were born between 1790 and 1799 in Quebec. So I'm looking at these guys. I tracked them, every one of them. Did they die in Quebec? Did they get married in Quebec? Did they have children in Quebec? Can I eliminate any of those people? I could eliminate from the 8, 6 of them. They were either dead or they were having children at the same time. Our Joseph Gilboe and Elizabeth Weigel are having children here in Essex County. So I know there's only 2 possibilities. One is Joseph Gilboe, who's born in Saint Paul de la Valcherie, son of Francois and Marie Archange La Rivière, Dite Rivière, or Joseph Marie Gilboe, who's born in Saint Roch de La Chagrin, son of Louis and Marie Jeanne Lahaye. After a lot of looking at the records, I actually picked the first guy. And the reason I picked the first one is that there was another child of those parents, Francois and Marie Archange, who went down into Essex County, into the Gosfield area, and not in the north, went down into the south. Francois Xavier Gilboe. He was the younger brother by about 20 years of Joseph Gilboe. There is no reason for that guy to be in the southern part of Gosfield. All French Canadians went to the north. They went to where other French Canadians were. They went to where the Roman Catholic Church was. This is so unique that my strong, strong feeling is that these are two brothers, and that's the ancestry of Joseph Gilboe. Now, you have the French names becoming English. You can have the reverse happen. You can have English names becoming French. There is a big part of the Arquette family in Essex County that were Urquharts, and they were either English or Scottish. They were absolutely not French. So being an Arquette does not make you French. I'm sorry if you're Arquettes, but you have to be wary of that. Another very, very common and well-known one in Essex County is the Deslip family. Very big family in the Amherstburg, Malden, Anderton area. Very, very big family. All descended from Philip Disley, who was born in London, England, about 1734. His parents are known. Philip and Disley and Anne Robinson. He got married in Quebec in 1768. If you look at the records for this fellow, his name gets Frencher and Frencher and Frencher with every record. So it turns off to just, and by the time they come down here in the early 1800s, this family is Deslip and they're so French. But they were very, very English. And this is another local name, Robidoux. One of the, Jean-Baptiste Robidoux, I think, is one of the War of 1812 heroes. The family was originally, the original ancestor for this family, and this is for the family in Essex County, the Jean-Baptiste Robidoux in the War of 1812, was Andrés Robidoux de l'Espagnol, and the de l'Espagnol is your clue. He was born about 1640 in Galicia, Spain, and his parents are known, and this is from his marriage record. So despite the fact you think that he's French, he's not, he's Spanish. The Meville family in Quebec is Swiss. There are families in Quebec that are Irish, that if you look at the current spelling of the name, you wouldn't have a clue we're Irish. There are families in Quebec that are from Portugal. There are all kinds of variations. So being in Quebec and having a French sounding name doesn't actually necessarily make you French. And one last comment I want to make is we make a lot of assumptions about our French ancestry, having come through Quebec or Acadia, which is the other common source. Some of them actually came here directly from France. If you see this in the census, it may not be an error, because there are people, and this is well into the 1800s this was happening. I did a research project at the beginning of the year on the Robinet family, who are married to the St. Louis, who's my sister-in-law's family. And the immigrant ancestor, Pierre-Antoine Robinet, was born in 1822 in Alsace. Very interesting story. He was a vintner. He came to Essex County with his family in 1754, and the reason they came is that they thought Essex County would be a good place to grow grapes and make wine, which was a very shrewd decision to make. Oh, sorry. His son, is Jules Robinet, had a very large wine company, grew all kinds of grapes, raised and made all kinds of wine, right up until about 1935. But the family came directly from France. So he would be one of those cases where you don't need to be looking in Quebec, because that's not actually where your ancestor came from. Now, I have a number, does the handout have the resources?
I have to admit, I did not do the handout.
Okay. I'm going to send off a copy of my handouts. And you might want to put it online and post it. It has sources, and I thought I had included it in the form that I sent. I did not. I'm going to tell you what they are, and it will be in the handout that's going to be printed. There are a couple of books that you can use. I don't really recommend books, but for the purpose of being thorough, I will give you a couple of books as sources. There's a Robinet book. Robinet is kind of the king of contemporary Quebec genealogy, and everything he touched was gold in terms of research. He did a repertoire of names of Quebec that included dit names. Excellent, excellent source. The old original standby source that people use for dozens and literally hundreds of years was Tongue, Volume 7 of Tongue. The National Archives of Quebec has a reference as well. There are some really good online sources for dit names. It's going to be included in what I give you. But what these sources are going to do is give you a list of names. I think it's kind of hard to just go through lists of names. Personally, I don't really recommend that. I think what you ought to do is look at more general genealogical sources. There are free sources and there are paid-for sources. I recommend FamilySearch.org as the first of the free sources. FamilySearch.org is the website that was established by the Mormons. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Salt Lake, if you go into the Family History Library in Salt Lake, the biggest family history library in the world, one of the first things you see is kind of a wall of pictures on the history of what the Mormons did. The Mormons collect family records for religious purposes that belong to their church. They believe so strongly that they have been collecting genealogical records since the 1840s, which is a massive amount of time, and they collect them very aggressively. They go anywhere. As soon as the Iron Curtain went down, they were in Eastern Europe trying to collect records. They film records, they buy records, they obtain records. I was actually there doing a research project and was looking for some information for a friend of mine who had family in central Ontario. The family were Presbyterian Scottish, and we couldn't find very much on them. And I knew the town that they lived in, and I was looking in their book collection. In the library, they had a pencil-written book that was a transcription of the records of a parish, Presbyterian parish, that was being closed down. The church no longer exists. As far as I know, the only copy of those records are in that pencil-written booklet. The sole copy being in the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, and my friend's family were in that booklet. So it's really it's really an amazing source. The second one I really want to recommend, and please make a note of this one, is Nos Origines, Nosorigines. It's a website that has family trees. And the reason I really recommend Nos Origines is that it has Acadian records. PRDH, which I use all the time, has Quebec records. It does not have Acadian records. And many, many people will have Quebec and Acadian ancestry. And to find Acadian records is much more difficult. They're not as well documented online. So Nos Origines is a good place to look for them. Now PRDH,
Could you spell that again?
NOS,
What?
NOS, like Shirley, ORIGINES, like Shirley, Nos Origines. And it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful website. I would really, really recommend it. Now, I've talked about this one a lot. It's PRDH. If you Google PRDH, it will come up. PRDH has free stuff and it has paid-for stuff. It will give you every single name in their records. Of their 65,000 names, it will give it to you as part of the free index search. But if you want to look at the screenshots that I showed you, you'd have to get into the paid for site. But even being able to look at the index is really helpful. And one of the things that's wonderful about PRDH is that you can put any one of the D names in, and it will give you the entire, that individual with all of the names. So if you don't know who this person is or what this person D name might be or who his parents are, if you put in the given name and one of the names, you've got a chance of getting all of the names. So it's a very, very good source to use. And it's a lot better than kind of doing it all on your own and floundering. Now, the paid for sites, I recommend you pay for PRDH. The way PRDH works is you pay for hits. When I do French-Canadian research, and I feel this very, very strongly, I look at all the lines. I don't look at the family name of dad, and that's it. I look at all of the wives and all of the lines for all of the people. That gives you a very good research project, but it gives you, it means you have to look at 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 records. So to do it really thoroughly, you can be looking at certainly hundreds and often thousands of records to research a family. And they sell them to you in increments of thousands. The second one I recommend is Ancestry. Ancestry, because it has the images. Now, we haven't really addressed this, but you need to look at the actual entry, the actual image for every entry that you're looking at. You've got to look at the records. We had kind of a discussion. We were talking about the Facebook page. There was a discussion on the Essex County Branch Facebook page about someone looking for an ancestry. And we had some discussion, and I put up the information from PRDH, which was the text transcript. And Suzanne Somerville from the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan, who is very smart and very right, said, you've got to look at the actual record, and she's 100% correct. Because the actual record may have more useful information. So you need to be able to look at those things, and anybody's transcript is subject to error. The actual record is going to give you the information that you have to have. Ancestry has, although it's a paid-for site, has most of the Quebec parish registers images. I'm saying most because it doesn't have all of them. The records it has are from the Institut Drouin. Now, we bought all of the Essex, not the Essex County, we bought all of the Diocese of London films from the Institut Drouin a number of years ago, the Essex County branch did, and brought them in, because at that time, that was the only way you could see the records.
We also got Indiana and Ohio.
Yeah,
too.
some of the Michigan ones, or the American ones, yeah. So that you could look at the actual records. The Drouin records were filmed from the first day of the parish, or the first day of the register that they looked at, until the day that they were there. They were filming in the 1940s and 1950s. So you'll see some records in Ontario that have baptismal records in the 1950s, because a friend of mine showed up in one of them. He was baptized like in 1955, and he was horrified that he was in Drouin records. If you look at FamilySearch.org, which is the free site, that has a wonderful index, but it also has, so that you can view it online, Ontario, for example, Ontario Catholic Church records. The downside of Ancestry is it's not indexed, so you've got to sort of search. You can narrow it down, you can sort of figure it out, and figure out how to narrow it down. But it also doesn't have all parishes, because the Mormons were allowed to film what the bishop of the diocese permitted them to film. The Diocese of London, the Bishop of London told them that they could film. The Bishop of Hamilton would not let the Mormons film their records. So the Roman Catholic churches in the Hamilton area were never filmed by the Mormons because that bishop wouldn't let them. I know that the Mormons came and approached the Anglican priests in Essex County because my minister told me that. And he said, and we said we weren't going to let them do it. And I'm thinking, I'm going to punch you. You know, why did you not let the Mormons film those records? So he said no. So it's sort of it was the choice of the bishop whether they were filmed or not. The other thing is, with the ancestry records, they were filmed a little bit later than Joanne, and by this time, privacy concerns were coming into play. And what happened was, London is a good example. The bishop said you may film to 1910. If you look at some of the records, you can see a page for the last entry in 1910, because underneath the pages were 1911 stuff. You see that in Essex County records. And so the Drouin has a little bit more information. If you're looking for things in the 1940s or 1930s, St. Alphonsus, for example, in Essex County, you need to be looking at the Drouin records, which we have here, or which should be an Ancestry, although Ancestry is iffy about some of the things that they have. And what I'm leading up to now is that the Institute Drouin has its own website, which is a paid-for website, that has absolutely everything they've ever filmed. None of it is indexed. Those films are not, they have some other indexes, but that is not indexed. But all of the records are there. So if you want to look at every French parish, or English parish, or Presbyterian parish, or Pentecostal parish in Quebec, because they filmed everybody. So my grandma, my mom who was born in Montreal, and my grandmother who was married in Montreal, they're in the Drouin records because they filmed out every parish in Quebec. You look at Institute Drouin, and you can do that as a Google search lookup. They're kind of pricey, but they're kind of worthwhile. Now, those are the things that I wanted to talk about. That's kind of a lot to lay on you. Does anybody have any questions? Cindy!
I have a question. I have no personal French in my background, but my last name is Robichaud, so that side does. I just noticed on one of your slides, in the women, the D had an E on the end of it. So is that feminine, but all the women would put the E on the end of it?
And it's pronounced deet.
Deet,
So
and the other is
D,
D.
like fee or we or me, and deet.
Okay.
Now, what you'll often see just DDD without the E, but technically, if it's, the women always has the TE.
That's the first time I'd seen it.
Have you ever come across, one of my ancestors' name was Teresa, who know deep Canada? I thought
Yes.
that was unusual.
No, that's a name. And it's a name that's, it's not that uncommon in
You said that there was filming of different denominations.
Quebec, yes, they filmed all the parishes.
What about British military activity in Quebec? So I'm looking at sort of time period around French and Indian Wars, and the guy I'm interested in is probably British, associated with Six Nations Indian Department, and at least has some association going into Quebec. And I know he married somebody, but I haven't any idea where he married.
I know that Drouin has things like the original Anglican records from Quebec, the city of Quebec. The problem is with the French Indian War, I don't know if we're dealing with before English occupation, which seems to be when the English churches were established. Otherwise, my guess would be that if there's a marriage in Quebec, it would have been a marriage in the Roman Catholic Church. That would be my guess. If they're traveling around, it could be anywhere, including New England. It could be anywhere.
You said the Institute Drouin was not indexed, but is it by parish then? You would look up the specific parish and then go through the books for the years.
Yeah, and you can sort of, when you're looking at the ancestry records, for example, it will give you, this film has this number of pages. So it covers 1900 to 1915, and it has 300 pages. If you're looking for something around 1908, which is about halfway through, you'd look about page 155. So those kinds of sort of cheap things that allow you to manipulate your way through them back and forth.
Yeah. I go through the church records through Ancestry page by page too.
The problem I have with Ancestry, number one, the transcription is horrible.
Yes.
I went to an OGS seminar a few years ago, and they had a woman there from Ancestry, and I went on purpose because I wanted to ask her about this. And I talked to her afterwards, and I said, you know, your transcription is horrible. And she says, I know that people feel like that. I said, who did this for you? And she said, Chinese people.
Oh, well, there you go.
And I said, why? And she said, because their script is character driven. It's based kind of on a symbolic alphabet. And what they're looking for when they get somebody to do it is somebody who will basically do character recognition. And they felt that that character recognition was the best way of getting into those records, because they were consistently, anyway, this is what she told me. Whether this is an apocryphal story or not, this is what I was given by the lady from Ancestry. The problem is that even if you're using the index, it's not necessarily going to have the person's name. One of the advantages you have if you're in Ancestry is you can correct it. But I'm correcting stuff on Ancestry all the time, so I have all of these, no, this is not right, this is transcribed wrong, this is the wrong thing. So sometimes even having an index isn't a really good idea. PRDH is a much better transcription. But I found a couple of errors in PRDH, including one I was just doing, where basically they attributed a child to one family, and I did what you're supposed to do, is I looked at the actual marriage record, and they put her in a family with a particular mom, and her marriage record gave a totally different mother and grandfather. Fortunately, so I had two things I could look at. And it took me a while, and I got back to them and I said, well, I don't think this is right. I think she doesn't belong to this family, she belongs to this family. And got back to me and said, I was correct, and they were going to change it. But mostly PRDH is correct, and Ancestry is kind of sucky.
Cathy, you said you talked to Ancestry about corrections, but do you email them or?
No, there's a hyperlink right there on the site. It says, do you have some comment you want to make? And it's usually, yeah, the name is wrong.
I'm using the library edition here at the library. Is that hyperlink on the library edition? Okay.
It's right there. It's the page that pulls up the individual entry. So it's got the transcription, and it's got the little image of that you click on to see the image. Right underneath the image is a place where you can do corrections.
Okay.
And I do them all the time.
I think it says,
So what is the protocol when
you're doing those corrections? Who's getting the final say?
They'll take anything you tell them.
They don't, they just add it
Yeah.
to their file.
There can be I've seen multiple corrections. Some of them I'm not even necessarily agreeing with.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So if you
So
correct
all of
something,
those
and then I go,
correct-
in, so it'll say Joyce Gagne corrected, it says it's this, and I can go in and say, yes, it's this, but it's also this, and it stays there.
Oh, I see.
It shows you all
Yeah.
corrections.
Shows you the alternative
Yeah,
names.
alternatives.
I
But,
see.
you know, you really absolutely should do that, because, I mean, I've looked at things where I know people haven't been able to find something for years. It's sitting there. It's just the transcript is wrong. And if I don't put the correction in when I recognize it, nobody after me is going to be able to find it either. So it's really important to try and put those corrections.
My grandmother.
So the actual file doesn't get changed, or their thing is,
No.
it's the
No,
comments.
the
that's
transcription
added.
gets changed.
The transcribed portion adds it, and that's when you see multiple like variations on, usually on a surname.
Oh, that could get crazy.
Because when I was looking for my grandmother, I couldn't find her, but her maiden name was there, Liezert. So what I ended up doing was putting her first name, her birth date, and where she was born, and it came up, and it's Swiegert. Like, I would have never found it.
You know, and sometimes it's you know, sometimes it's a census, for example, if that's what it is. Sometimes the census is wrong. The enumerator didn't understand what the person's name was. You've got a classic issues with French and English. You've got an English enumerator hearing a French name with English ears. So he's writing down what he as an English person thinks that name is, which is not necessarily remotely the same as what the name actually is. And you get the flip side with French enumerator and English names. And you see this in Essex County census records all the time.
Yes, I've often wondered why one of my ancestors had a certain deep name. I'm not sure you can answer this question, but there were two Pierre Rions that were in Sandwich area around the same time. One would have been the uncle of the other. The uncle, for some reason, who was here first, he took on a deep name. And I often thought, well, maybe it was because he wanted to be different than the.
That is a
the
very
nephew.
common reason,
But
very common to
The name
distinguish
he
yourself from
picked
someone else.
was like deep, famous, THEMUS. I can't figure out where that comes from. I don't think it's any land. I don't think it's anybody else's name.
You know, I'm sure there was a reason for it, but I'm also sure that in a number of instances, we're never gonna know what it was. It could be very particular just to them. Look at, Latrino Jeanette. If you didn't know that this was a little guy and people called him that, where would you think you would get that name from? That's just so strange. Or Louis Valerian at St. Louis. How would you ever figure that out if it wasn't part of this known story?
I've often wondered if Marinette wasn't because he had a red head.
Although Marinette is a name that came from France, so you definitely see Marinette's going all the way back. And the one family that I got that was related to Margarita Wapakikiwe was a Marinette.
She wouldn't be a redhead, but
Going back to the ancestry there, I had that issue with my great-grandmother. Her last name is Hachet. And because they spelled it Hachi, because the accent overtopped the E, they mistaken it as an I, and I had to go on.
And this is their version of character recognition.
Yeah.
This is what they're seeing it as.
And it's as simple as that. I would have never thought that they'd spell it with an I. And then when I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, I can see where they mistaken the E with the accent as an I, because it's a simple.
But you do what Betty said. I mean, you try all these other, weaselly ways of getting in. You do first names, you do places of birth, you do approximate ages, you do all kinds of variables. The one thing I will say about French Canadian genealogy, and this truly is my experience, everybody is there. Almost never will you be stuck. I can count on two hands the times I have not been able to find somebody. And I've looked at thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of records. They're all there. If you're having a brick wall, you just haven't found it yet. You can have problems in English records or Scottish records or anything else, but French Canadian records are absolutely fabulous. Don't get sidetracked by the D names. That's there to help you. It's not there to hurt you. Just keep telling yourself that.
I found some families where the children took either name.
Yes, yes.
So the
Or
children and their
only
children
one
might-
child will pick up a different name. And all of a sudden they go off in some tangent with a whole different name. One child out of 12.
I've also seen where, like with my last name, Fidel, all the spelling, like I've seen throughout the years, like with my great-grandfather, I had the hardest time finding his marriage record. Yeah, and he on the name, there it is. That's like, wow.
So Trudel, Trudelle, Trudele, all kinds of
And
names.
I've
What do you think
seen
is a simple name?
throughout my family tree, some of them drop the L, some of them drop the E and the L, and all the different spelling
You just have to
variations.
be flexible. You just have to be flexible.
in the Napa family, there's a number of children, and some of them are Nantais, and the others are Nantau.
Yeah.
It really makes it hard to prove that he's his brother, but they really would.
But, there are enough records that you should be able to put it together. You should be able to put it together.
You brought up that they're Nom de Guerre. De Guerre, that's like a guard, like the de Guerre. Is that like a family, would that be considered like family of? Because
The Nom de Guerre were all military names, military nicknames. That's what they were.
Guy.
Normally.
Guerre means war.
Yeah,
Name
Guerre
of
meaning
war.
war. And the Nom de Guerre were like the Carignan regiment. If you came in and there was, if you came into one of the big French regiments, most of those recruits, most of those soldiers had D names, and an awful lot of them came out of the regiment itself. So that's, the whole nom de guerre concept is basically army related.
It struck me because my last name is DeGia. And
That's a different name. I know that name, but that's a different name.
so I said,
You're
DeGia.
going everywhere.
So DeGia. No.
Yeah, and you probably have like 6 different D names once you start going back and start looking.
Yeah, La Frown, Rosier.
Mhm.
And where did that come from? So-
Well, if you have Antoine de Rosier and Anne Leneuf, you would be a very happy man. One of the things that I do look for when I'm always when I'm doing French genealogy is Anne Leneuf. And if you have Anne Leneuf, who married Antoine de Rosier, you are descended from William the Conqueror and Charlemagne and Alfred the Great through Henry I of England. And it's one of the royal lines that is accepted and documented, and the documentation was done originally by René Jeté, who I refer to as kind of the king of Quebec genealogy. What's her name? Anne Leneuf. Actually, Anne Leneuf and her aunt Jeanne Leneuf. The Leneuf family. And Anne Leneuf, I know, married Antoine de Rosier. And I'm always looking for Anne Leneuf. And the Robinet family that I just did, he was 5 times descended from that family. I'd never seen that before. So there's multiple lines back to lots of royal people.
What a message.
That should be quite clear.
That's the problem. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Where are you going?
The other one.
Oh, you're going backwards.
The other one.
Are you going back?
No, the other way.
Oh.
Read.
Cathy, on behalf of the Essex branch at OGS, I want to thank you so much for providing a most informative presentation, helping us understand the idea of D names. Because I think many of us, and myself particularly, often wondered how that fit together, and you've given us a tremendous experience and understanding of what they're all about. So thank you so much, appreciate it.
And you've opened up a bunch of doors.
One other thing, before you put your pens away, if any of you actually have any questions or are stumped, please feel free to send me an email at Cathy Knight 2, the number 2, @gmail.com. I won't do your whole family tree, but if you're stumped, I'd be happy to look up for you, absolutely happy.
On screen at the moment is something we wanted to make known to people. The French group, genealogy group within the area here, had been out of operation closed because they lost their building facility they were in. And there's a notice here indicating they have now found a new home. And they are opening, and as it said, on April the 9th, they had an open house indicating where they are, letting people see what they have. So if you're interested in continuing with French genealogy, the location for this French group is 940 Prince Road. They're located in the Maryville Convent on Prince Road, 940 Prince Road on the 2nd floor, and you enter off College Avenue. So they're back in business, and we certainly are very happy to have that opportunity to have that resource available to our members. Again, thank you very much.
And these guys have wonderful records, really first-rate records. They've done the transcripts of all the local parish registers, and just first-rate.
They're only open on Tuesdays though, right now.
From 10 in the morning.
Just one extra announcement here, please.
The Windsor Public Library would like to invite everybody here to, on Thursday, April the 14th, for the Central Library, 2nd floor, we will have an unofficial unveiling of the local history / archives new work area, study area. So you're all invited to that at 2:00 in the afternoon, 2 to 2:15.
Thanks, Tom.
So we'll make sure that we get Kathy's handout and we'll put them on the website so that you have availability. Kathy, did you have a page written up that already had the links on it that you were talking about, your resources, that we could just flip out if anybody missed it and they wanted to write it down?
I got it right here.
Okay, so if anybody wanted to write it down, if you missed it, maybe grab it, or then it'll be on the website afterwards too. So, thanks so much. Thanks to everybody at home as well.
So do you have the age?
Just Google PRDH. So just step letters. Program to share something.
Yeah.